My name is Natan Slifkin, originally from England, now of Ramat Beit Shemesh, otherwise known as the Zoo Rabbi for my interest in the animal kingdom in Jewish thought. But today it's not exactly regular animals that I'll be speaking about, it's dinosaurs and the topic of the development of the universe. And that's today's topic. Now, we'll start off with a very simple question. Was there any such thing as dinosaurs? Do you believe in dinosaurs? Somebody once said to me, do you believe in dinosaurs? I said, no, I believe in God. And he meant, no, what I mean is, did dinosaurs ever exist? So, did dinosaurs ever exist? Yes? How do you know?
We find them.
What?
We find them, parts of them.
You?
Not specifically me.
So, how do you know anyone's found them?
I trust the establishment.
You trust the establishment. So usually people will say, you see the bones, right? You see the bones at the museum. So here's the T-Rex at the American Museum of Natural History. And I put it to you that those bones are fake. What would you say to that? I can't prove it right now, but take my word for it, those bones really are fake. Yeah. There are real bones, but the ones you'll see in display are not the real bones. The real bones are usually much too valuable and fragile to put on display. Well, you can't really see it in this picture, but in this box is the, I believe, the real skull. So yes, although the ones you'll see, posed like that at the museum are fake, there are plenty of real dinosaur fossils that we find. It's not only skeletons of dinosaurs that we find, it's also footprints. This is Dinosaur Ridge in Denver. Right outside the city of Denver, there's this mountainside where there's hundreds of footprints of different dinosaurs in the side of the mountain. Herbivores, carnivores. Here you see the bigger footprints of herbivores. There's an adult and a juvenile. And then the skinnier footprints are from a carnivorous dinosaur. Well, either dinosaurs or some really big chicken. Now, it's dinosaur footprints, right? There's hundreds and hundreds of dinosaur footprints in the hillside there in Denver. Fantastic sight. Another place where you can see dinosaur footprints is in Yerushalayim. So if you ever go to Har Nof, if you look down the hill from Har Nof, you see a little village called Bet Zayit, right? And in Bet Zayit are the footprints of the original Yerushalmi, Elaphrosaurus. Elaphrosaurus was a dinosaur about 9 feet tall. Lived on a diet of hummus and falafel, and that was the original Yerushalmi dinosaur. Okay? So we have lots of remnants of dinosaurs. I happen to have with me a genuine dinosaur tooth. 100 million, it's 100 million years and 6 months old. I know that because it was 100 million years old when I got it, and that was 6 months ago. And this is from a juvenile Spinosaurus. Full-grown Spinosaurus was bigger than T-Rex, about 45 feet long with teeth about this big. So this is from a juvenile Spinosaurus. I'll pass it around, but I'd appreciate it if you could keep it in the box, because once I was passing it around and my previous Spinosaurus tooth, the person dropped it and it smashed to smithereens. Imagine that. Preserved intact for 100 million years, and this guy breaks it. Not so much, about $50. If you want to get a Spinosaurus tooth, there's a store called Evolution in Soho, which has all kinds of artifacts of nature and fossils. You can get one there.
What if they're fake?
What if they're fake? A reputable dealer. There are ways of telling apart the real stuff from the fake. There are a lot of fakes that go on eBay, for example. If you look for dinosaur eggs, there are a lot of fake dinosaur eggs being sold. But there are ways of telling apart the real stuff from the fakes. Now, in terms of maybe all the dinosaur bones are fake, so there are people who believe that there's some great global conspiracy of scientists, or that, but I mean, there's not. There's hundreds of places in the world where you can find dinosaur fossils, dinosaur skeletons, right, and so on and so forth. So that's the evidence for dinosaurs. Now, the next question is, though, when did these dinosaurs live? Maybe dinosaurs just lived like 3,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago. Maybe they were wiped out in the flood, couldn't fit onto the ark. So how do we know that that's not the case? How do we know that dinosaurs did not live 5,000 years ago? Yeah? No human records of them, yeah, but maybe the people who saw them didn't live to tell the tale. Yeah, that's definitely part of it, but something even more concrete than that. How do we know that dinosaurs didn't live 5,000 years ago? Anyone? Carbon-14? Okay, but now you're getting all scientific on me. I'm a very simple person.
It would have been reported in human writings.
That's what he said, but it's something even more powerful than that, more concrete than that. It's very simple. In the layers of rock where you find dinosaur skeletons and footprints and eggshells and so on, that is all you find. In those layers of rock, you don't find fossils of people or cows or cats or dogs or lions. It's a different layer of rock. And it's not as though dinosaurs are only found in 2 or 3 places or even 20 or 30 places. Dinosaur fossils are found in hundreds, thousands of locations around the world. And in all those places, in those layers of rock, that is all you find. You don't find fossils of contemporary mammals in those layers of rock. So that is how we can even see with the naked eye that dinosaurs did not live at the same time as people. So it's true you can use carbon dating also, but I don't like to bring that up because then people will say, well, how do you know that it's accurate? You know, maybe it's not so accurate. And I don't want to get onto that. I want to use something that's more simple and more irrefutable. All right, the dinosaur bones are in different layers of rock. You see, my point is not to prove necessarily that dinosaurs lived 100 million years ago. The point is, did they live within the last 6,000 years or not? Because in other words, once the world is more than 6,000 years old, so we have this question as to how to reconcile science with a Jewish calendar. It doesn't make a difference at that point if the world is 10,000 years old or 1,000,000 years old or 1,000,000,000 years old. As long as it's more than 6,000 years old, we have a question that we need to deal with. So in order to prove that we have a question that needs to be dealt with, we just have to show that dinosaurs lived more than 6,000 years ago. And that's something that you don't need carbon dating for. You can just see it from the layers of rock. Right? From the layers of rock, you can see with the naked eye, you can see that dinosaurs did not live at the same time as people. Right? So that's what presents us with the question regarding the age of the universe that we have to grapple with. So what I want to do is briefly survey a few popular approaches to this question. Explain why I don't like them, and I'll present a different approach and then come back to discussing dinosaurs in more detail. So one approach is to say that, well, all we know is that we find dinosaur skeletons in the ground. That doesn't mean that there were ever once living dinosaurs. Maybe when God created the world, he made it complete with dinosaur skeletons. I really don't like that approach for lots of reasons. I mean, I just find it preposterous, right? It's like God out to fool us. You know, I think when you find the skeleton of an animal, it's very reasonable to assume that that was once a live animal, and I don't think God expects us to think any differently. You know, there's a mitzvah of egla rufa. If you find a person who's been killed, you find a dead body, you don't know who the murderer is, so there's this whole procedure you have to do, a procedure of atonement. Well, how do you know the person was killed? Just because you find a body with a knife in the back? Maybe he was created that way. No, we don't assume that. Right? When you find a body of a person with a knife in the back, you assume he was murdered. If you find the skeleton of an animal, it's reasonable to assume that that was once a live animal. I don't see any reason to assume otherwise. So I really don't like the idea of God creating the world with dinosaur bones. Then there are people who suggest, and this was first suggested in the 19th century, that maybe the mammal had the effect of making dinosaurs look older than they are. That was suggested in the 19th century, and perhaps that was a reasonable suggestion in those days, but now we know that that doesn't work for the reason I mentioned before. Because even if the mammal made the bones somehow look older, however that would work, but what about separating them all out into a different layer? Right, and the point is that all the places where you find dinosaur bones, you don't find bones of contemporary animals in that layer of rock. So that's how we know dinosaurs did not live a few thousand years ago. So there's another interesting approach mentioned by the Tiferet Yisrael of Yisrael Lipschitz. He's one of the commentators in the Mishnah, and in his time they had just discovered the first dinosaurs. And he has an essay called Drush Or HaChaim, printed at the back. You'll find it at the back of certain editions of the Mishnah, except for those that it's been ripped out of, because some people don't like what he says. And he describes the dinosaurs that had just been discovered in his day. He describes Iguanodon and Megalosaurus. He mentions them by name in Hebrew, right? Iguanodon, Aleph Yud Gimel, Aleph Vav Nun, Vav Daled Vav Nun, Iguanodon. He spells it all out. Megalosaurus, speaks about how big they are and where they lived and what they ate. He also describes mammoths and mastodons. And Yisrael Lifshitz says that this confirms a traditional idea based on the Midrash and Kabbalah, which is that Hashem created different worlds and destroyed them. And our world, the creation of which is described in Bereshis, is only describing the current era. But before Bereshis, the Midrash says that God created worlds and destroyed them, and these fossils are remnants from these previous worlds that God created and destroyed. And that's the approach of Yisrael Lifshitz. So, it's a very interesting approach, and it's very refreshing to see that he confronts the issue head on. He doesn't try and ignore it. He doesn't claim that God created skeletons. And he describes the dinosaurs at great length and with obvious fascination. But in terms of reconciling the conflict with science, this approach is not really going to work for us anymore. Because according to Yisrael Lifshitz's approach, right, the dinosaurs, that whole era of history, is from before Bereshis, which means that just 5,772 years ago, God recreated the entire world. But that certainly doesn't fit in with what we know from modern science. Right? From modern science, we don't see that less than 6,000 years ago, the entire world was wiped out and recreated. Right? So his approach does not help us, but it's still interesting to see how he tackles the question. It's valuable in that regard. So probably the most popular approach for resolving the question about the age of the universe is to say as follows. When does the Jewish calendar begin? What is point zero in the Jewish calendar? What day of the week does the calendar start on? Right. It starts with the creation of man, not with the creation of the universe. Right. So it starts with the creation of man. That's when the Jewish calendar begins. And before that, you have 6 days. So the question is, how long is a day? So in English, the word day can mean 24 hours. It can mean the period of daylight, right, day as opposed to night. It can also mean an era, right, day of the jackal, day of the triffids, anyone who recognizes those references. And in Hebrew, the same thing. In Hebrew, Yom can mean 24 hours, Yom can mean Yom versus Laila, and Yom can mean an era. Hine ba Yom Hashem, behold, the day of God comes. It means an era. And there's a pasuk which says that a day of Hashem is like 1,000 years. Right, it's like the old joke of the guy says to God, he says, is it true, God, that in your eyes 1,000 years is just as a second? And God said, yes, it's true. And the man says, and is it true, God, that in your eyes $1 million is just as a penny? And God says, yes, it's true. So the man says, well, can I have a penny? And God says, yeah, just a second. So the idea is that the 6 days of creation need not be days as we know them. Each day could be billions of years long. So that's how we'll fit everything together. Right? The question is that science puts the age of the world, well, the world is 5 billion years old, the universe is 14 billion years old. Right? So science says the universe is 14 billion years old. The Torah says that the universe is 6,000 years old, plus 6 days of creation. And each of those days was billions of years long. Right? That's a widespread, popular approach. However, it's very problematic. Why? Because when it comes to actually fitting the events described in Ma'aseh Bereshis, in Genesis, with that which we know from modern science, they still don't fit together. What's created on day 3? Plants, the plant kingdom. And what's created on day 4? The luminaries, the sun and moon and the stars. Right, you've got the sun and the moon and the stars coming after the plant kingdom. But the picture that modern science draws is very different. The sun and the stars are billions of years old. The plants only came along a few 100 million years ago. So the order is different. Then what's created on day 5? Day 5. Fish and birds. And what comes on day 6? Land animals. Right? And man. So you have fish and birds, and then land animals. What's the order that we see in the fossil record? What comes first? Fish. What comes after fish? Land animals. What comes after that? Birds. Right? In the Chumash, you have birds coming before land animals. In the fossil record, you have land animals coming before birds. Right? So there's a problem of fitting in the sequence. And that's why there's also another very popular approach, which is to say that 6 days can equal 14 billion years, using relativity and all kinds of complicated, dazzling scientific equations. Right? So we know that time, the flow of time, isn't so simple. Right? Time can flow at different speeds in different places and under different circumstances. There was an experiment when they put 2 super accurate clocks on planes. One plane was flying around the world east-west, one was flying west-east. When the planes landed, the clocks showed different times. Right? Astronauts would come back from the moon, so time has moved at a different speed for them. Right? We know time flows at different speeds under different circumstances. If you're in a shiur, if you're watching the Super Bowl, right, time flows at different speeds. So the idea is that 6 days can really equal 14 billion years. It just depends where in the universe you put the clock and whether you're using some nifty, fancy scientific equations. But that suffers from the same drawback that, okay, that solves the overall, perhaps solves the overall duration of making 6 days equal 14 billion years. But still, what do you do with correlating the sequence of events? So there are certain popular books in Torah and science that try and reinterpret the Pesukim of Bereshis to make the sequences correlate. So they come up with suggestions like when the Torah says that the plant kingdom was created before the sun and the moon and the stars, it doesn't mean that plants were made before. It means that the building blocks of genetic matter in space appeared before the sun and the stars. Problem is, if you look at the Chumash, it speaks about God creating every grass and tree and bush and herbs. It doesn't say anything about the rudimentary building blocks of genetic matter. Or when the Torah says that birds were made before land animals, so people say, well, it doesn't mean birds, it means flying insects. And flying insects came before land animals. But that doesn't work either. I mean, it has to work within the text. Flying insects have a special name in Hebrew. What are flying insects called in Hebrew? Sheretz ha'of. Appears in the laws of Kashrus. But in Bereshis, it doesn't talk about Sheretz ha'of. It says Kol of kanaf. Every winged flying creature, including insects, but also birds. You can't just say that the words mean whatever you want them to mean. Now, words have a specific meaning. So all these ingenious attempts to creatively reinterpret the text of Bereshis to fit it in with the sequence in science, they just don't work. No Bible scholar would say that the words can have that meaning. And there's another problem with that approach. So some people would have you believe that you have to creatively reinterpret the Pesukim in this way and in that way, and then that's how to interpret Bereshis, and then it fits with modern science. But according to that approach, Bereshis has never taught anybody anything. Right? Because for the last 3,500 years, Bereshis wasn't being translated the way they want you to. Right? So it was all wrong. Everyone was missing it. And now they say, we'll translate it this way to make it fit with modern science. But now you don't need Bereshis to teach you modern science because you have modern science to teach you modern science. So people who take this approach of creatively reinterpreting Bereshis to make it fit with modern science are totally undermining Bereshis, and they're saying that it's never been useful. Because it was always interpreted incorrectly until now when we don't even need it. Because why would we need Bereshis nowadays to teach us modern science when we have modern science to teach us modern science? So I find that it trivializes it, it undermines Bereshis. It turns it into a meaningless text, apart from the textual difficulties. So I'd like to present a different approach in terms of understanding Bereshis. And it's one that's difficult to grasp, and it's not entirely without its own difficulties. But I feel that it's the most authentic in terms of understanding what Bereshis meant to the people who first received it, and in terms of making it, resolving the problems with Torah and science. So as a prelude, we have to preface this with the words of Rambam in the Guide for the Perplexed, where Rambam says that contrary to popular belief, the account of creation is not all to be interpreted literally. So we see two very important ideas there. Number one, that Bereshis is not all to be interpreted literally. Number two, that it's contrary to popular belief. Right? Rambam had a hard sell with it also. But what we have to really ask ourselves is this. I love science. I'm a big fan of science. I've been reading science books all my life. But that is not what Torah is out to do. Torah is not out to teach science. Torah is out to teach theology. Religious lessons about God, about man and his place in the universe. A specific type of theology the Torah is out to teach. Ethical monotheism. Now, if you're writing a book So depending on who your target audience is, that's how you'll package the contents of the book. Right? If you're writing a book on Barney the dinosaur, right? So your target audience is 4-year-olds. You're writing a book on Harry Potter, right? So your target audience is 35-year-olds. Right? So depending on your target audience, that's how you'll package the ideas in the book. Now, if you're God writing the Torah, who is your target audience? Right, so it's got to be binding for Jews in all times and all places, but simultaneously you're going to have to choose, a group for the packaging it. So you're going to packaging it towards the most basic audience, and there'll be deeper layers of meaning and so on. But certainly the primary basic audience is going to be the people coming out of Egypt, the Bnei Israel coming out of Mitzrayim. Why are they the basic audience? Why is the basic layer of meaning going to be oriented towards them? A few reasons. Number one, because they're the first. Right? They're the first people to receive the Torah. And also, they're the people with the least Jewish background. Right? So you're going to have to really introduce things to them at a basic level. So people get wary, understandably nervous, when you say that Torah is oriented in any way specifically towards a particular generation. Because they get worried, or maybe what are you saying? It's not applicable, it's not relevant today. Now, of course, we believe Torah is binding at all times and in all places. Nevertheless, it's definitely true that the packaging of the Torah is oriented towards a particular time. Right? Laws of damages. The Torah doesn't talk about an SUV crashing into a truck. It talks about a donkey falling into a pit. And it's oriented towards the Bnei Israel. In fact, even in the mitzvos, right, so Rambam famously and controversially said that the laws of Karbanos are because God had to adapt to the fact that sacrifice was just the form of religious service that people were used to in those days. And God modified it in terms of Karbanos, right? So everybody else went crazy with Rambam. How could you say such a thing? And people nowadays, so then people said Rambam didn't really mean it. Really, Rambam meant this and that, and it's not really controversial at all. But the problem is that Rambam knew full well he was saying controversial, because he prefaces it by saying, I'm going to say something controversial, and you're not going to like it, but I think it's true anyway. Right? So he didn't want to be reinterpreted. But that was with mitzvos. That's a slightly more radical approach. Certainly when it comes to not mitzvos, not halachas, but just conceptually, there's very much an idea in the Rishonim that the Torah packages its messages according to the worldview and the requirements of the Bnei Israel. An example, all the anthropomorphisms of God. Right? The Torah speaks about the eyes of God, right? The hand of God, God's back, God's feet. So what's going on with that? So some say, well, it's a metaphor. Right? It's a metaphor, like when you speak about having a chip in your shoulder or a frog in your throat, it's a metaphor. But Rambam, 1 and 2, the other has shown him, they didn't hold it was a metaphor per se. Rather, it was a concession to the worldview of the Bnei Israel, who were not capable of grasping God in incorporeal terms. There's two basic views of the Bnei Israel in Jewish thought. There's one view that they were inconceivably great Torah giants whose wisdom we cannot even begin to touch a grasp of it. And there's another view which was no, they were slave people who came out of Egypt. They experienced some pretty special things, but they were a slave nation who had to evolve psychologically, religiously. And that latter approach is something you find in a lot of the Rishonim. The Chovos Halvavos says that why does the Torah speak about reward and punishment in the here and now and not in the hereafter? So he says because they were not yet sophisticated enough to relate to reward and punishment in terms of Olam Haba. They had to hear about it in the here and now. And that's why God is described in very corporeal terms, because that's how they could relate to him. Right, so we're going to be looking at the Torah not as teaching as science, as modern science, right? Because that would be, firstly, it would be pointless. Why does the Torah need to be teaching modern science? That's not one of the Torah's goals. What the Torah is doing is teaching theology, and doing so adapting to the knowledge and to the requirements of the Bnei Israel. Now, so what was it? What was their knowledge? What was their requirements? So certainly the overall theological message of the Torah is ethical monotheism, and ruling out paganism and idolatry. And if you look, you look at the Torah and you see it's rife with commandments and ideas relating to the evils of paganism. And thank God the Torah has been very successful. Right? There aren't too many, there isn't too much pagan child sacrifice around nowadays. So, now of course, all the Torah's exhortations against idolatry, they still have relevance, they still have application. There's a good book by Kenneth Siskin on modern idolatry, not people sacrificing their children to idols, but modern manifestations of idolatry. Right? So there's certainly still a level of applicability, but in its basic form, there is less paganism around nowadays, precisely because the Torah has been so successful. Right? So you can't complain at how can you possibly say that Torah is more oriented, some parts of it are more oriented towards one generation than another. How can you say parts of it are less applicable now? Well, thank God they are. Because if the Torah, say, commandment against child sacrifice was equally applicable at all times and equally relevant at all times and all places, not applicable, relevant, then that would mean that the Torah has completely failed to uproot that from society. Right? It's precisely because Judaism has been so successful, both directly and through its offshoots of Christianity and Islam, at undermining paganism, that many of the Torah's exhortations against paganism have become less relevant. Baruch Hashem, that is the result of the Torah being successful. So we have to realize that the number one goal of the Torah was ethical monotheism, getting rid of paganism. And that was the particular hurdle at the beginning when the ancient world was steeped in that worldview. So that is what the Torah is aiming to do with Bereshit. And you see, the problem is, again, that the monotheistic worldview it's been such a success, it's embedded itself so deeply in Western culture, that it's very hard for us to imagine any other way of looking at the world. So the real way to understand the significance of Genesis is to look at what other people were saying about the creation of the world back then. And we have examples of that. For example, we have the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation epic. Here is a very, very small part of it discussing the creation of the heavens and the earth. Then advanced Tiamat and Marduk, the counselor of the gods. To the fight they came on, to the battle they drew nigh. The Lord spread out his net and caught her, and the evil wind that was behind him he let loose in her face. As Tiamat opened her mouth to its full extent, he drove in the evil wind, while as yet she had not shut her lips. The terrible winds filled her belly, and her courage was taken from her, and her mouth she opened wide. He seized the spear and burst her belly. He severed her inward parts. He pierced her heart. He overcame her and cut off her life. He cast down her body and stood upon it. When he had slain Tiamat, the leader, her might was broken, her host was scattered, and her helpers, the gods, who marched by her side, trembled and were afraid and turned back. They took to flight to save their lives, but they were surrounded so that they could not escape. Now, after the hero Marduk had conquered and cast down his enemies, he returned to Tiamat, whom he had conquered. And the Lord stood upon Tiamat's hind parts, and with his merciless club he smashed her skull. He split her up like a flat fish into two halves. One half of her he established as a covering for heaven, and so on and so forth. Right? So creation was about, there's all these different gods in the world, all these different forces of nature. They're all fighting it out, and from that chaos, that clash of the titans of these fighting gods, gradually a kind of stalemate is reached, and the world settles into the shape that we see it in now. Contrast that with the Chumash. God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. Boring, plain, but we just take it for granted because we're so used to it. Right? In the ancient world, this was a radical way of looking at things. What, one God, and he makes everything in the world? How can there be one God? There's so many conflicting forces in the world. One day it's raining, one day it's sunny. You see forces of weather fighting against each other, all different animals fighting. There's not just one God. There's a whole cacophony of different spiritual forces out there fighting it out. Coming along Judaism and says, no, one God. He makes everything you see in the universe, and it's all good. It's all for a specific purpose. So the biggest, most powerful point of Genesis is the one that we totally take for granted because we don't realize how differently people used to look at the world. There is one God, and he makes everything in the world. He makes it for a purpose. What about this short span of time? Well, again, Torah is not describing things from a scientific framework. I mean, look, it talks about the firmament. What's the firmament? There is no firmament. There's space. There's no solid firmament. But it's speaking about packaging things within the worldview of people in the ancient world, where the sky was a solid dome. All right, so what the Torah is saying, all these phenomena that you see in the world as you see it, don't think it was created by this clash of all different pagan deities and a dragon being cut in half and so on. One God, and he makes everything. What's the idea of the short span of time? That you see that there's setting the stage for man. A few days, everything's made, man comes on the scene, and that's where history begins. Right? Teaching you an idea that what we do in this world matters. Rav Kook points out that had the Torah speaking about the creation of the world over billions of years, so people would think, well, we're insignificant. We're just a blip in history. Why do we count? Now, the important message that people walked away from the Torah with was that what we do counts. The universe is a stage for man's actions in this world. And what about when it comes to the sequence of events? So again, we're not going to be trying to map the sequence on to what we know from modern science, because the Torah is not teaching us science. If we look at the 6 days of creation, we'll just deal with it very briefly. So we see something interesting. Numbers, sequences of numbers can be portrayed differently. The 10 Commandments is not a sequence from 1 to 10. It's 2 sets of 5. And there are correlations between the first and the sixth and the seventh and the second and the seventh and so on. If you set out Bereshit in that same pattern as 2 sets of 3, you see day 1 light, day 4 the luminaries. Day 2 the sea and the sky, day 5 fish and birds. Day 3 land and vegetation, day 6 animals and man. Right, the first set of 3 days are creating the elements, which are then utilized in the second set of 3 days. And there's a lot more to it than that in terms of the sequence. Haven't got time to go into it now, but there's a book, The Challenge of Creation, currently out of print, but I did bring some copies in, and you can buy them at the farm sale downstairs after the lecture. But just to give you an insight, again, to what's going on here. So Ralbag says, referring to a point we mentioned earlier about the sun coming after the plant kingdom. So Ralbag says, what's going on with that? From a scientific point of view, you'd expect that the sun is a prerequisite for plant life. You'd expect the sun to come before plant life. But Ralbag says, what's the point of the Torah? Teaching theology, ethical monotheism, fighting against paganism. What did every pagan person worship? There was one God that everyone worshipped. The sun. Everyone worships the sun god. Right? Very important God. Comes along the Torah, and the sun doesn't even make the top 3. Right, it's demoted to a relatively insignificant place after the plants. So according to Ralbag, it's teaching you, don't think the sun is one of the primal cosmic deities. The point is always to look at the messages that the Bnei Yisrael got from the Torah. Not try and reinterpreting the Torah to match modern science, which makes it pointless, but looking at what it meant for the Bnei Yisrael. And an easy way of doing that is by contrasting that with the other accounts of creation that were being told at the time. When we do that, we see what the real power of Bereshit is and how it revolutionized mankind, teaching the idea that there's one God and he created the entire universe. And in fact, science itself began from that. Books, non-Jewish books in the history of science explain that science only really took off as a result of monotheism. Because the whole idea of science is looking for laws that govern throughout the universe. But from the pagan mindset, what do you mean? There's no laws that govern the entire universe. It's just chaos out there. Only with a monotheistic mindset that there's one God who created all the diverse phenomena in nature does it then make sense to look for laws of nature. Right? So science itself was an outgrowth of monotheism. And it also, it tells us how, we take the monotheistic perspective for granted. But it was so revolutionary in the world. And Bereshit is what helped develop this perspective. But let's get back to the dinosaurs, because I like dinosaurs. Okay, so we've explained that the Torah is not giving a scientific account of creation. But then, where does the Torah mention dinosaurs? Can you tell me, where are dinosaurs in the Torah? Taninim. So the word tanin appears in several places in Tanakh. Sometimes it refers to snakes, sometimes it refers to crocodiles. So you see it refers to reptiles. And in Bereshit, we have this pasuk. God said, let the waters be filled with many kinds of living creatures, and birds that may fly above the earth and the open firmament of heaven. And God created the great Taninim, great reptiles, dinosaurs. Isn't that cool? No, it's bogus. It's not referring to dinosaurs. How do I know? Why isn't that referring to dinosaurs?
Scientific evidence. No scientific.
Nope. No, just from the pasuk. Why can that pasuk not be talking about dinosaurs? Not quite creeping. talking about creatures that live where? In the water. This is day 5. This is talking about aquatic creatures. So it's not talking about dinosaurs. Taninim here, what it means what it means elsewhere in the Torah. It means monstrous serpentine creatures, crocodiles, whales. It doesn't mean reptiles, and it doesn't mean dinosaurs. So some people say, well, maybe the dinosaurs are the behemoth of Eov. Right? Look, a lot of Christian websites speak about behemoth being a dinosaur, because behemoth is described as a huge, strong animal. Right? Behold now, behemoth, he eats grass. Right? His strength of his loins, power in his belly. He has a tail like a cedar. Right? So what huge animal is there with a tail like a cedar tree? Sauropod dinosaur. Okay, but again, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, Hashem is talking to Eov about a sauropod dinosaur. Eov never saw a sauropod dinosaur. They've been extinct for 65 million years. All right, so Hashem is not going to be telling Eov about the sauropod dinosaur. Instead, behemoth is actually referring to a hippopotamus. Hippopotamus does not have a tail like a cedar tree. However, as the Mefarshim explain, tail here is a metaphor for a different part of the hippo's anatomy. There's another suggestion about dinosaur that appears in the Torah. In the list of non-kosher birds, you shouldn't eat them, tinshames. So we have a bird here called the tinshames. And then, when it talks later in Pasha Shemini, it talks about tumah, spiritual impurity caused by reptiles and vermin. So it also mentions again the tinshames. So some say, well, how can the tinshames be both a bird and a reptile? It must be Archaeopteryx, which was the bird dinosaur. It had wings, feathers like a bird, but it also had teeth, a long tail. It had lots of claws. Right? Skeletally, it's a dinosaur, a reptile. So you see, Archaeopteryx is in the Torah. Isn't that so cool? I'm very suspicious of things that are so cool. Why is this preposterous? What, Hashem's telling us about the kashrus of something that's been extinct for 100 million years? That's what the Torah needs to discuss, the halachas of Archaeopteryx? And does it tell us the halachas of Triceratops? Is that kosher or not? What about Diplodocus, plesiosaur? Are those kosher? It's ridiculous. The Torah is not going to be telling us the kashrus of something that's been extinct for 100 million years. So you have a creature that has two creatures with the same name. Right? They have something in common. So there's explanations as to what they are, why they have the same name. But you're not going to say that because you have the same name appearing in a list of birds and a list of shirotzim, therefore it must be the dinosaur bird, Archaeopteryx. Where are dinosaurs in the Torah? The answer is that dinosaurs are in the Torah in the same place that the Torah describes kangaroos and iPods. Nowhere. Torah doesn't discuss them. Why would the Torah discuss dinosaurs? I think the whole question is preposterous. Again, the Torah is oriented towards the Bnei Yisrael, teaching them ideas, mitzvahs they need to know. Torah doesn't even mention all the animals that exist today. It doesn't mention butterflies, doesn't mention pandas. It's certainly not going to mention things that are unfamiliar to the Bnei Yisrael. Right? It doesn't mention kangaroos. They lived in Australia. It wouldn't mention dinosaurs. They were extinct for 65 million years. So we should not expect to find dinosaurs in the Torah. What we may ask, though, is, why did God make dinosaurs? They're not even in the Torah. Why make them? So, we don't know God's mind. It could be that assuming that God wanted to create the world using a system of natural law, and the way to do that is evolution. So it could be there's some inevitable byproducts along the way. Maybe dinosaurs are an inevitable byproduct of using the evolutionary process. It's something that I elaborate on in more length in my book, The Challenge of Creation. But what I really want to discuss is a different thing, which is really the question to ask is not why did God make the dinosaurs, but what can we learn from dinosaurs? Right? As Jews, we should be striving always to grow as Jews and to see what lessons we can take from the world. So what lessons can we take from the dinosaurs? So I think there are two lessons. One more obvious, one less obvious. Let's start with the more obvious one. What happened to the dinosaurs? They're extinct. Why? Too much smoking and drinking? Where did they go? What happened to them? So the most popular theory is the meteorite theory. Right, a great big meteorite about 10 miles across slammed into the world. Luckily there was a video camera there at the time, so we can watch it.
3,000 kilometers to the south, the massive comet crashes into Earth.
Some baby T-Rexes.
The light from the impact fades in silence. Then the shock waves arrive. Next comes the blast front. Finally, a rain of molten rock starts to fall out of the darkening sky. This is the end of the age of the dinosaurs. The comet struck the Gulf of Mexico with the force of 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. In the catastrophic climate changes that followed, 65% of life died out. It took millions of years for Earth to recover, and when it did, the giant dinosaurs were gone.
Okay, so that's what happened to the dinosaurs. A meteorite about 10 miles across slammed into the world and wiped them out. There's other theories too, but that's the most prevalent theory. Now, the Torah says, Zechoyimos Olam, we're supposed to contemplate history. Specifically, we're supposed to see God's hand in history. More specifically, we're supposed to see however much man thinks he controls his own destiny, man plans and God laughs. Right? So you have these mighty empires that thought they were going to rule forever, and they just fall apart in the twinkling of an eye. Terrifying, right? The ancient Egypt, and the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, right? The British Empire, right? The German Empire. All these mighty empires who thought they would rule forever just collapsed. And we're supposed to take a lesson of humility from that. But nowadays, we might not take that lesson of humility because we might say that, look, we've got powers the likes of which has never been seen before. First of all, we have the United States of America, a superpower. No other country is even close to the United States of America. Second of all, we have technology, like nuclear weapons, cloning, all these miracles of technology. So more than ever before, there's a risk that people might think that we are the masters of our fate. But now we have something else in our vocabulary. Extinction. Global extinction of dinosaurs. Right? We now understand the fragility of life on Earth. And when it was discovered back in the 80s or 90s, when it was discovered that it was a giant meteorite that wiped out the dinosaurs, so people started to wonder, it could happen again. Right? What would happen if another 10-mile meteorite were to come and hit the Earth? There was a near miss a few years ago. So what would happen? So there was a lot of discussion about it. A bunch of movies came out presenting different scenarios. Right, the basic idea was that NASA would develop a new kind of space shuttle that could land on the meteorite, and they'd send somebody, preferably Bruce Willis, to land on the meteorite and to plant a nuclear weapon that would blow it to smithereens. Right, so that's the idea of how the world would be saved. In real life, it would never work. First of all, even if you could plant a nuclear weapon on a meteorite, even 600 feet down, it's not going to vaporize it. And the meteorite is 10 miles across. It's just going to break a tiny bit off the shell. So there's nothing you could do with the meteorite. Second of all, in the movies, they had like 2 years lead time. In real life, do you know how much lead time we'd have? Any guesses? Maybe a day. That's how much advanced time we'd have. The universe is a big place. The telescopes are only covering a tiny, tiny fraction of it. Right? We'd only get about a day, maybe 2 days advance notice. Right? So if another meteorite were to come this way, it would be the end of life as we know it. And the point is, it's in a vocabulary now, in a global extinction. So that's an important lesson of humility to take from the dinosaurs. Then there's another, perhaps less obvious lesson that I think we can take from the dinosaurs. About 15 years ago, I picked up a book of science fiction stories, all of which were relating to dinosaurs in one way or another. And one story in particular caught my eye. It was set a couple of years in the future. And it was about a woman called Bertha who was very upset for two reasons. First reason was that her husband, Sam, had rented a time machine which he'd used to bring back a small dinosaur from the Jurassic era. And he was keeping it as a pet, you know. And she was very upset because they were a retired couple. And all their friends were, you know, socializing and going to the latest opera, the latest theater. Whereas here was her husband just obsessed with this primitive relic of the past, taking it for walks, cleaning out its cage, and so on, instead of keeping up on the latest social trends that her friends were doing. And the story continued that the second reason why Bertha was so upset was that her son Milton had gone to Yeshiva in Israel and had become Orthodox. Right? This is in this non-Jewish book of science fiction stories. And it spoke about how all her friends' children were doing the latest high-tech, latest careers, whereas her son was in Jerusalem poring over these ancient texts of an obsolete religion. And the point of the story was to draw this parallel between both her husband and son, who were both obsessed with primitive, obsolete, archaic relics of the past. Her husband with dinosaurs, and her son with Judaism. Can't remember what happened at the end. I think she was eaten by the dinosaur or something. But the point is that the author of this story, not only did she not know much about Judaism, she didn't know much about dinosaurs either. The word dinosaur, apart from referring to the creatures that we all know and love, has also come to mean something primitive, right? Something obsolete, archaic. Why? Because when dinosaurs were first discovered, it was assumed that they were giant reptiles, like overgrown iguanas. Now, what's a reptile? A reptile is a cold-blooded creature. They're kind of sluggish, slow-moving. Right? They're not very intelligent. I have a very large iguana that I'm very fond of, but he's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And the idea was that that's what dinosaurs were, right? Overgrown iguanas, brain the size of a walnut, cold-blooded, slow, sluggish, probably couldn't even lift their tails up off the ground as they staggered along. And the reason why they became extinct is because the mammals came in the scene and the dinosaurs couldn't keep up. The mammals were the new model. They were warm-blooded, which meant that they were fast and they were smart and they were agile. Dinosaurs were obsolete, primitive. That's why they became extinct. However, beginning in the 1980s with some very brilliant paleontologists, that whole view of dinosaurs changed. Because they found that these paleontologists started pointing out that the fossil picture it didn't add up. They started counting the ratio of herbivores to carnivores. Now, if you go to Africa today, what is the ratio of herbivores to carnivores? It's about 98% herbivores, 2% carnivores. Now, you need to have a lot of herbivores to keep all the carnivores going. You need to be many, many more herbivores than carnivores. Now, if dinosaurs were reptiles, cold-blooded reptiles, then you'll see a very different ratio. A big python, it'll eat a pig and it will sleep it off for the next 4 months. But what's the ratio of herbivorous dinosaurs to carnivorous dinosaurs? Again, 98% to 2%. I know that the carnivores are the ones who get all the press because they're so cool. But really the ratio is 98% to 2%. The same as in warm-blooded mammals of today. They found dinosaur nesting sites. Now in dinosaur nesting sites, you have dinosaur eggs that are about this big. And inside that egg is a curled up baby. When it comes out, they found juvenile dinosaurs about this big. And they also found young dinosaurs about this big. Now, everyone agrees that dinosaurs are not living at home for a long time after they're born. Right? They're not Jewish or anything like that. Right? So the point is that it means they're growing very rapidly. And that kind of rapid growth is not something you see in reptiles. Then the clincher was they found the fossils of Deinonychus, which was a dinosaur very similar to Velociraptor that became very famous in Jurassic Park. Deinonychus and the raptors, they were bipedal dinosaurs. They stood on 2 legs. And they had this big claw on their feet. Huge claw like this. And it's very clear that their method of attack was to leap up in the air and slash. Smart. Museums all remodeled their dinosaurs. When I was a kid, the museums displayed dinosaurs as dragging their tails on the floor behind them. And now they remodeled them to have the dinosaurs thrashing their tails in the air. So it's now become realized that dinosaurs, they weren't primitive in any way. On the contrary, they were around for hundreds of millions of years. That means that they were very good at what they did. Right, so okay, in the end, an act of God, a meteorite, what can you do? But the fact that something is old does not mean it's primitive. On the contrary, if it was around for a very long time, it means that it was very advanced and very successful. And the same is true with Judaism. The fact that it's old does not mean it's obsolete. On the contrary, the fact that it survived for so long through so many millennia, through so many different cultural, political climates, and every generation it's produced outstanding intellectual, moral accomplishments, means that it's very advanced, it's very successful. Right? So unlike dinosaurs, Judaism has not become extinct. But like dinosaurs, Judaism is something that withstood the test of time and produced outstanding successes.